Guruve Gaurachandaya Radhikaya Tadare Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadabhaktaya Namo Namaha Vanchakalpatrubhyascha Kripasindhuvevacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Dhanuvat Pranam devotees. So I'm trying to keep up with the questions and answers live, and I will, because I have a lot to do today, I'm going to just read a question that I had. I can't read all of it because, again, somehow when questions come, they seem to be very long. And then I need to read something else, which is in regards to the subject matter. So the question was, let me get it out here, all right? So the question was, Prabhuji, I see your classes online and on YouTube, which I didn't really know that there were classes on YouTube so much. But I see them. I appreciate your classes. I did have a question. Sometime back, you mentioned some things about spiritual bypassing, and you didn't seem to be in favor of the idea that such a thing goes on in terms of bhakti community or a spiritual community. I also recently saw another post about spiritual bypassing on Facebook. I've also seen many senior devotees also speaking about it. So I wanted to know what your idea was in not so much, what is this? Oh, not so much condoning it. I couldn't see this. Not so much condoning it as far as devotional practices are concerned. Could you explain why? Then she goes on to talk about some of the things that have gone on in the devotee community, like divorces, relationship problems, people just having struggles, internal struggles and so forth, and why the concept appears to her to have some validity. So I think first I want to make clear that I believe I've always spoken of this topic in relation to looking at it from the perspective of what is pure bhakti, and looking at it as a understanding about how we repose faith. So I don't think, and she didn't mention that here, and I don't believe I have in the past done sort of a condemnation of it as much as an analysis of it and a critique of it based on the fact that it is relatively new term, also based on the fact that it is something that when it's used in a certain way or has a certain application in regards to bhakti, then it can have ill effects on the outcome of trying to obtain pure bhakti. So first let me read what spiritual bypassing is so we're all on the same page from the person who introduced it into the lexicon. So the person who introduced it was a John Wellwood, I believe his name is, Wellwood. And apparently he belonged to a Buddhist community. You can read more about him. And he observed in that community how people apparently were using the principles of Buddhist practice and doctrine, I would imagine in his literal term, to bypass dealing with emotional or psychological or relationship issues, etc. So, of course, a couple of things. One is that by profession, he's either a psychiatrist or psychologist. I cannot remember. So, there's two lenses, obviously, that are being brought into play here. One is, I guess, his view from his practice in Buddhism, and the second would have been from his academic background in psychiatry, psychology, whatever it was. So here's what the term means. Spiritual bypass or spiritual bypassing is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. So, as most terms that get introduced into common parlance or attempt to be put into common parlance often sound on the face of their definitions really logical and sensible. When it comes to bhakti, we have to, in many ways, apply a different template. Because the process of bhakti, the theology of bhakti, the basis of bhakti is not something within the material paradigm. And therefore, there's not really an association that can be made really in earnest with sort of common material perceptions and conceptions with bhakti. Why is that? Bhakti itself is a transcendent reality. So it is not a simple matter of a faith, or it's not a simple matter of a life space, or a matter of a individual pursuit, so to speak. It may be all of those things in some sense, but in the deeper sense, bhakti is an absolute transcendent reality. So we have to keep it in that place and then bring things to measure in relation to it. But bhakti itself has to stay in its lane or in its proper defined space. So what is bhakti? So Rupa Goswami Pad has defined it as being Anya Abhilasita Sunya Jnana Karmadi Anavritam Anukulyena Krishnanu Bhakti Ruttamam. Bhakti is that transcendent reality which establishes the removal of superfluous, because in the deeper sense, they are just that, the superfluous desires that have arisen in relation to the Atma or the soul, which is transcendent, over the course of many, many lifetimes that are uncountable and have created impressions in the subtle body of the Atma that has been carrying the Atma from one gross body to another. So, in other words, what we are defining bhakti as is the very idea of the removal of all the superfluous desires, impressions, samskaras they're technically called, that have been housed in a subtle body and has traveled with the actual transcendent soul from one gross body to another. So the removal of any of those, and by the suffix ita, anyabilasita, ita means except those things which are in the natural course of human existence. For instance, self-preservation is a natural thing. So, in other words, a desire to save one's life, right? You have some kind of very deep illness and you're taking medicine for that. That does not go against the principle of pure bhakti. It doesn't mean that, oh, I should be anya abhilas sunya. I shouldn't have any other desire, not even a desire to save my life or to save the life of a loved one. So it doesn't mean that. And Rupa Goswami clearly defines it and gives examples of it, right? Then it says, Anukulyena Krishna Anusilanam Bhakti Uttama. This is Uttam Bhakti. This is pure bhakti that has as its intrinsic quality the desire to render through all endeavors anukul service to God. So again, if you take that understanding and you also apply the understanding that this statement is actually a definition of the soul itself, Jivera Sarupoye Krishnera Nityadas, that this is a description of the transcendent reality of every being. So it's not another methodology. It's not a faith. Faith will be applied in order to come to understand it, but it itself is not a faith. It is a transcendent absolute reality, right? That the soul is a a part and parcel of God, and the nature of the soul's real activity and real existence is in connection with a relationship with God in a certain loving capacity, which we see reflected here in the material world. Right? Because you cannot say when and who created the various kinds of nuances of relationships in the material world, like fraternal, paternal, conjugal, etc. We don't have a date nor personality who we can attribute brought that into the material arena. So we know it has to come from a source beyond material existence. So bhakti is that revelatory epiphany that people have when they practice bhakti. Here's the source of real love, real relationship, etc., etc. So my point here being that bhakti is not part of a material paradigm. It is absolutely spiritual. So when you speak about concepts like spiritual bypassing and you want to apply that to bhakti, you have to see if it fits. So according to the very definition, let me read it again, of spiritual bypassing: the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or to avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. So first of all, using bhakti to accomplish any of these things is not sidestepping, which is the very first word. The tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep. But if you have come into the association of devotees with the intent to even resolve unlimited personal issues, interpersonal issues or interpersonal issues, then you have not come to sidestep them. You've come to resolve them in an absolute fashion. There are two kinds of medical approaches. One medical approach is to go to a holistic practitioner. Generally, the viewpoint of a holistic practitioner is to root out the very cause of any dis-ease or any kind of sickness that you may have. So they will address very root issues. What is your diet? What is your lifestyle? What is your activity in terms of whether it produces stress or not? So they'll look at all of the very the very nucleus of whatever the issue or problem you may be physically or mentally having is, right? In terms of holistic practitioners. But those who are, in the Western paradigm of medicine, so to speak, everyone accepts that they're primarily concerned with external symptom relief, right? So they may give a diagnosis, and then they try to address what they've diagnosed with removal of the symptoms that a person is having. If you're having constant headaches, right? So it may very well be due to, maybe the nature of the diet, because the diet, in many cases has many, synthetic foods and genetically modified foods, etc., etc. So could that possibly be causing the problem? Yes. But in Western medicine, they don't really address that idea that maybe you should eat more organic or maybe more whole foods. But perhaps taking this particular medicine, which reduces the symptoms of your headache by either blocking the vessels or whatever it might be, I'm not a medical professional, right? Then here's the answer. So in the same way, from a spiritual point of view, in dealing with interpersonal or interpersonal issues, Krishna consciousness is a holistic approach, that it looks at the root cause of what your problem is. So it's not a tendency to sidestep the problem. It is a deep look at the root of a problem, and it approaches the root of the problem head on. The root of the problem is that the Atma, under the influence of ignorance or avidya, so also sometimes when we hear the word ignorance, we may get pinched, because everybody thinks only in the material sense of ignorance. But avidya means not having vidya. Vidya means knowledge. So not having knowledge of my real identity, my real existence, is called avidya. So we shouldn't take it that it's ignorance in a derogatory, demeaning sense. It means not having knowledge of our existence. And because we don't have knowledge of that existence, a artificial consciousness emerges, which is called our chitta, right? And in that chitta, in that antakaran or chitta, our inner subtle body, arises a sense of asmita, means I'm somebody, I just don't know who I am. And because I don't know who I am, then our karmic portfolio from one life to another presents us with a particular kind of ahamkar, a false egoism. And that false egoism manifests inside of the karmic package we have, which is called an upadi. Upadi means a particular designation. I'm born to this family with this racial makeup, this gender makeup, this kind of social status, etc., etc. Right? So these false identities that are impressed on the subtle body of the Atma and are vicariously identified by the Atma, then give rise to innumerable kinds of issues, right? So, especially depending on a person's karmic portfolio. So, bhakti, by its both practice and theology, and I would suggest really in a deeper sense, most spiritual practices don't really aim at sidestepping an issue. They really more deal with going to the root of an issue, and by application of practice in that particular spiritual path to remove the very source of problems, which is ignorance of one's own identity. In Srimad Bhagavatam, it's clearly mentioned there that the problems which face the living entity are superfluous to them. They're not born or generated from a reality. They're born or generated from a false identification and a particular attachment to that false reality that, unless it is broken, you may remove the symptom of one thing, but you've not removed the root cause of the problem. So we can't really apply the term spiritual bypassing to bhakti, because bhakti is the actual methodology and the actual destroyer of the root issues when applied with the appropriate faith, devotion, dedication. It is doing that. Just as if you take up the holistic practitioner's modality and you're going to change your diet, lifestyle, habits, etc., then you're dealing with the root of whatever your dis-ease is or sickness. It certainly may take longer. It certainly may not produce immediate results. It certainly may not produce a pleasing evolution to health, because you may go through detoxing. You may have to go through various stages of purifying the amount of accumulated toxins and everything in the body. So it may take some time to get done for one, and two, it may not be such a pleasant experience in the beginning. So many people look at bhakti and say, listen, I didn't get that epiphany of Radha Krishna dancing with ankle bells and the wonderful smells of Vrindavan. I've been doing this 10 years and it didn't really happen. And so now, in the midst of my divorce, in the midst of my personal crises, in the midst of my emotional upheavals that are coming from some previous samskars, etc., I consider that to hear someone tell me that my answer is in deeper dedication to the practice of bhakti as spiritual bypassing. No. That person is giving, if they're being honest, the actual whole mechanism by which your suffering in the deepest sense can be removed. So that's not spiritual bypassing. Now, we may take a look at ourselves and see, oh, well, I may not be able to respond. Like, to the holistic practitioner. I may not be able to simply change my diet. I'll try to modify it somewhat. I can't really say I'm going to change my living habits. I'll try, right? So if that approach is taken to bhakti, then the results will be according to the nature of the faith and dedication, etc., etc. Right? So it's not that bhakti, and I would go on to say perhaps many other spiritual paths, I don't want to speak for everything, but I don't think that if it's truly a spiritual path, that the use of it is spiritual bypassing. I think the use of that path is the means of uprooting the various emotional, let me go back and read what it is he says, removing the various unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks, right? Because if we're able to come to any mature levels of realization in that chosen path, then these things should be happening by the nature of the epiphanies we have along the way. I really have always had deep, not me, I'm giving an example here, right? Someone may say, I've always had problems in dealing with relationships. Well, perhaps it's because I have not been ever able to really define my own existence in a clear way. I haven't realized anything about my own existence in a clear way. And therefore, every time I get into a relationship, I look at the person I'm dealing with as a fulfillment to a void I have. Will that cause problems? Because I'll have expectations going into the relationship of the need of that person to fulfill a void, right? Maybe I may not realize I'm doing that, but I'm doing that, right? So yes, that will cause problems. So the answer is not just going to be, well, I'll dive headlong into looking and analyzing and meditating on that problem, because in the long run, the answer is still going to be the same. I will need to come back to the table and face myself in relation to myself, my real self, right? Because unless I have a clear understanding of who I am, how can I have a perspective on how to relate to anyone? If I can't relate to myself, truly, how can I relate to anyone? So any relationship that's void of the people involved in relationship having self-realization, right? Then how is it possible that you'll realize harmony in a relationship? Because whatever it is you don't know about yourself will play out in that relationship. And it will cause some difficulties, etc., etc. Right? And that will lead to emotional scars, which is also mentioned here, right? So the other part of this, and I'm going to kind of conclude, the other part of this is the suggestion that the spiritual path, and I'll even use Buddhism. I mean, I have more perspective, obviously, in Krishna consciousness or bhakti. But even if this person was a Buddhist practitioner and he observed this, what is the nature of the statement being made? That my chosen absolute perspective on life, which is my spiritual self, was inadequate to produce the changes in the things like my emotional issues, my psychological wounds, or my unfinished developmental tasks. My spiritual path was not capable. It was not potent enough to resolve these things. So now the thing becomes, well, what will do that? So now here's where I think some question comes, because now the idea becomes maybe perhaps this person, being an academic professional as far as psychology is concerned, may consider person needs to deal with psychological modalities, right? And that very well may be. I'm not at all suggesting that a person may having some kind of deep crisis or whatever the case might be, might not need some counseling or need actually some psychiatric help or whatever it might be. But what I am saying is that to say that a person trying to apply their very faith that they have in their life that is bypassing the issue is I don't really understand that. I don't. If I am experiencing some kind of crisis and I'm taking a deeper shelter of the spiritual reality, who am I, who is God, what is our relationship, how am I bypassing an issue? Now, I know for some people it may be difficult because some people may be genuinely going through an interpersonal crises, and perhaps even their mate, when they're going through these things, may not have a sense of maturation about how they express the spiritual or have good consciousness of the spiritual application of what they practice, and therefore it sounds like they're just spouting out some philosophical or theological idea, and they're not giving consideration to the state of their partner's, emotional distress or their partner's lack of fulfillment, etc., etc. Or if it's an interpersonal thing, they may feel that simply hearing, you're not the body, that you have a relationship with God, they may feel that has become rote for them, and it's not truly addressing some emotional crises or something that is born from some scars in their consciousness they have that they just can't get past. So, but my point here is don't conflate that struggle with the fact that trying to apply the principles of spiritual life or spirituality is trying to bypass dealing with it. Because it's not. I may not have adequate maturation to apply it to myself or to apply it to someone else in such a way they can digest it at the time and get the benefit of it. But the process itself, we can't deny its efficacy in resolving these things. If so, then what kind of potency does your spiritual ideal have if it can't remove your material problems? How potent is it if it can't remove your material problems? And then is there maybe a question of looking at my application? Is there a question of looking at my maybe perhaps ineffective practicing of it? I mean, maybe there's other considerations, right? So this is why, again, it was not a condemnation of spiritual bypassing. It was not wanting to allow that term for whatever purpose beyond what I've just read that the original author of the concept meant. All right, I didn't want that it could be associated with, especially with bhakti, but with any spiritual path, I would imagine, that can be conflated. That the use of spiritual principles or spiritual practices is a bypass of dealing with real issues. Because then what that does is it makes spiritual life relative. It says that it's another relative modality which was ineffective in dealing with certain things, and the attempt to continue to use it then is spiritual bypassing. So, I don't know how clear I was on all of this, but I wanted to try to answer your question. So in a nutshell, no. Any application of a true spiritual path is not spiritual bypassing. It is an attempt to effectively use the principles, practices, and the spiritual potency inherent in that particular faith in order to actually deal with your problems. So it's not bypassing them, right? And if someone is feeling, well, no, that Mukunda, that's not really the definition. The definition is people who artificially try to use it, but that's a different discussion. That becomes a different discussion. I address that. That somebody who either immaturely or void of true understanding of application of a spiritual practice and its principles attempts to avoid dealing with something, then that's insincerity, right? But you can't conflate that somebody telling somebody, oh, well, listen, or, Didi, Mataji, listen, we'll have to chant more, or we'll have to take shelter more. That kind of suggestion as a solution to our material problems of any sort is spiritual bypassing is not correct. All right, my Dandavat Pranam devotees, and Didi, I hope this answered your question somewhat. If not, you can always, again, contact me and we can have more discussion, perhaps personally. But as you asked, I did it as a Facebook Live. That way, other people can also make points, and that may also be helpful. All right? Jai Vancha Kalpa Turuvishya Kripashindavevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe.